I'm not streaming these, but I just jotted down some things that were of interest to me over the last 2 days. I asked that question earlier on about autonomy. We had lots of conversations about AI actually impacting creative communities, with one of the more obvious things being jobs. And I wanted to suggest that perhaps, someone said something like, I think Pierre might have said this, that AI is not going to replace job X, but people working with AI in that job are going to replace the people not working with AI. Yeah. But
poor old radiologists, they're always the punching bag for like replacement
they're the test
medical
case
stuff, aren't they? They're the fruit flies of AI in medicine.
But going back to that, the conversation all the way back this time yesterday about Spotify and Warner, and it was amazing to have Simon from Warner being so in that mainstream music space, because most of the conversations I'm in are not quite in that space. And I slightly missed that we didn't have an artist presenting a more grassroots conversation. But this idea of maybe AI-generated music just flooding the market, whatever that might mean, however that might play out, was obviously a threat that in various ways people identified but maybe couldn't quite grasp. And I think we do struggle to frame those visions of the future. And also, I'm thinking about the metaverse, which it's not somewhere I'm planning to go and spend time, but it's probably somewhere that I'll find myself spending time for one reason or another, via my kids or something. So these new spaces, like the social media space or the space of Spotify, are spaces that we've kind of maybe willingly walked into, but maybe just been dragged into kicking and screaming, or just not noticing that we're in these spaces, and suddenly the world of media consumption has changed. So very broadly, in some of the things people said, I saw this as maybe one of two possible threats that we should be seriously extending a discussion around. And then this question kept coming up, particularly with T and Angie yesterday. Sorry for everyone for having to bend your necks. What are we doing any of this for? And on a personal note, I spent quite a few years working as a creative technologist making stuff because I was extremely excited by technology. So I thought I knew what I was doing it before, and possibly for various reasons, me changing or the environment changing, I've become much more interested in stepping back and looking at other people doing this stuff. But something really did change in the field, which is I've been a member of a community called Computational Creativity for since my PhD, so 15 years. Very small conference of people really focusing on the idea of machines making things, with a great deal to offer, I think, to the wider creative AI field, which in many cases has grown up independently of that lineage. But a lot of that work was philosophical for a really long time. We wanted to make machines, make music, and make art in the spirit of maybe someone like David Cope, who was a big provocateur. He would make machines play Bach and trick people and sort of pose this deep question of, like, why does it matter, or what is it about human that you care about, and why does this offend you, and this sort of thing. But given these threats, and given the evolution from that more philosophical question, which still exists but has shifted quite a bit, to the applied, the design and the applied stage of the field, the what are we doing it for comes back again. And that question again of like, how do we put commercial organizations, innovation and critique all together in the same space? I think that's still an incredibly relevant question. So I'm just taking chairs, freedom to put those up and provoke and get some discussion. But what I'd like to do straight away is just, we've got 3 PhD students, and to get the PhD perspective. So maybe just starting from the far end with Stephen, and just tell us very briefly what you're doing.
So I'm Stephen. I'm from Sensi Lab Monash University, and my PhD is centered on interpretable co-creative systems that you can create with, but aren't just spitting out random outputs, something where you have more interaction, more dialogue. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I worked with creative technology before, and it was frustrating because I felt like I wasn't interacting with anything. I was just having something continuously generate until I liked it, and that wasn't fun, and I wouldn't use that again. So I want to make something that people want to use.
Cool. I'm Chloe. I just finished my undergrad last year, and I'm about to start my PhD at UNSW in term 3, so very soon. And so my PhD kind of centers on the topic of, like, if we consider the limitations of latent space in a machine learning context, how can we nonetheless kind of engage with it in creative ways?
No worries. And I'm Rodolfo. I'm one of Ollie's PhD students working in a very similar space as Stephen, co-creative systems, human AI creative collaboration. I think I'm really excited and scared at the same time about the possibility of the automation of human creativity and you know, kind of automating the activity that I think is the most beautiful for humans, which is creating art and what gives meaning to life, or one of the activities that gives meaning to life. But I think what I'm really fascinated about is creating systems and designing interfaces in a way that they don't replace humans, but work with humans as collaborators or as tools, and really, I think we have a lot of say into what direction the systems go towards. I don't think it's a deterministic system necessarily, even though some people do believe with good reason that it might be. But I do think we have a lot of saying towards the direction in which these systems go. So yeah, I'm researching dialogic creative collaboration, which is understanding how humans and AI can engage in creative dialogues via natural language or just different interfaces that allow this dialogue to happen. So I don't know, should we just dive into the questions? Yeah.
And introduce himself too, and then
G'day everyone.
dive in.
This is the first doctoral consortium I've been a part of for quite a while, since I graduated 10 or more years ago, so it's nice to be back. My interest with a lot of this creative AI stuff, I'm a computer musician by training. I mean, Ollie, you mentioned the David Cope stuff. Interestingly, as you know, that often the knock on David Cope was that he like annotated the heck out of his bark. And there was always this knock that, like, well, of course, Emmy, you know, the algorithmic composition engine he wrote generated kind of cool stuff. Certainly, superficially, if you went into that, you'd sort of listen to it and go, oh, that's quite pleasant. But the knock on him was always that it required very detailed annotations so that the algorithm could kind of know where he was marking up, like, phrase boundaries and all sorts of kind of stuff. And in the computer music community, that was considered a bit cheating or something. It's sort of hard to say, but yet data set engineering and that kind of thing is just part of life now with these huge, like, billion plus parameter, like multi-billion parameter models. I mean, to some extent, the models are now so big that you can't really curate, or there's only really a few big data sets in the world that have been curated at scale with any sort of quality. So computer music's the community I've come out of. What I'm really interested in now is, and this was sort of what the tool app platform that I was demoing yesterday, I'm interested in loops. There's no doubt that these models are amazing and terrifying and kind of mystifying in a lot of ways, and also they're very banal statistics in other ways. And people are doing really interesting stuff with them, sort of input-output kind of call and response style. One of the things I liked about Jay's talk earlier was the way that they had chained up a few, you know, input into one and then output goes into the next model and stuff. One of the things I'm interested in is, like, the meta phase space of all of these models in totality. When you hook them up in arbitrary networks, where does it end up? What sort of attractors are there in that phase space? How sensitive is it to the prompt, or is it the specific topology of the models that you've chained up end to end that is the primary determinant of the behavior? I don't know the answers to those questions, but that's one of the things I'm interested in creative AI. Lots of people are doing cool stuff, and I just want to connect all those cool things together and see what happens.
It is a very cybernetic approach.
And I work in the School of Cybernetics.
There we go.
So yeah, talking about feedback loops is kind of my jam.
Great. Well, yes. Let's talk about those themes. Ben's already riffed. You're dying to jump in, aren't you, Rodolfo? Yeah.
I think I've been very critical in this symposium, but I tend to be a very optimistic guy in this space. But I just think it's good to talk about the threats in this space, which is an interdisciplinary space, which brings people from different perspectives. So talk about the threats. And I think one that I'm particularly concerned about, which is kind of flooding the market and creating spaces that we're forced into, is just following the trend of social media and really the most important AI algorithms used today are in social media platforms, basically to extract as much attention as possible from the users. That's basic optimization that they're doing. So if you follow that trend, this company is adopting AI generation of content, then it makes a lot of sense for them to generate the content for the users. And it's just gonna be content precisely tailored for the user. So you're gonna get a YouTube where you're gonna just click generate, give me whatever I want in this moment. It's just gonna know exactly what kind of content you want to consume. And you're just gonna consume that content, and it's just gonna extract your attention to the maximum. And then you extrapolate that to the metaverse and to virtual reality. So then you're gonna hook a VR headset, and then just gonna go into this world that is perfectly tuned for you. That's an AI being being critical. No,
Stella Solar's in the room.
yeah. So yeah, this kind of idea that now you hook yourself into a metaverse, and then it's this this intersection between AI generated content, companies trying to maximize your attention, and the metaverse seems very scary to me, and I think we should be taking that seriously. And I think a lot of the time we talk about no, AI is not going to replace human creativity. It's kind of like the initial knee-jerk reaction, and we say no, it's not going to replace human creativity. But it's not about replacing human creativity. It's that the social impact that it can have, when these technologies are adopted at scale under the current socioeconomic systems that we have. And if you just follow the trend, we probably should be very concerned and hands-on in terms of how we regulate this sort of stuff, and thinking about open sourcing this algorithm so they're not just optimizing towards profit, but optimizing towards other things. So I think that's just just what I wanted to comment on the threats.
Yeah, that's right. What's the benefit of scaling content? What's the benefit of just creating more content to take more attention? So we were discussing yesterday. It's, as someone that grew up on social media, I'll admit that I do have this like subconscious addiction to like my Instagram explore page. It's like sometimes I'll end up on it, and it's like a real addiction. And so imagine now I've got AIs generating. It's not about are they going to replace creatives? It's like, are they going to just get me hooked, make my addiction worse? That is something that, I share that fear.
Do you think AI is powerful enough to? I mean, I kind of think that addictive telly is already peaked, but maybe we're only a little bit there.
Maybe on TikTok. It's
Thankfully not. But I mean, there's
I was gonna say specifically with TikTok, I think kind of these platforms are designed for you to stay solely within that platform. So when we think about something like AI music, like flooding spaces, or even like already on my timeline, there are AI filters on TikTok where you generate something based on on a text prompt, and you're kind of sharing that, or like you generate and then share within kind of 40 seconds. So it's kind of interesting to think about how kind of these AI filters or even AI music becoming a large part of TikTok, which I feel like it's very feasible for that to happen. All of that kind of just encourages you to stay within the one platform and not to link out and learn more. Nowhere in this AI filter is there somewhere to click and be like, oh, let me understand how this works. Or it's all kind of, keeping you in that space. Even when you click on the source of the filter, it's just taking you to thousands of other people who are using the exact same filter. But there's kind of no, in some ways it's great because it's kind of awesome that people who have no experience can use an AI filter and kind of, get, it's like an entry point. But in other ways, there's kind of no way to link out to go a little bit deeper without, of course, knowing which words to put into Google.
Just back to when you said, is it possible, would it be possible for AI to generate this content? Well, I think there was a time where I didn't think that the quality of images that we're getting from DALL-E 2 was possible. Just to create, if I ask it, just generate a random person to then generate someone that doesn't exist but looks so realistic. I didn't think that was possible. So, you know, it could be potential where they can generate 10-second videos, which...
And people are already doing that. Just this week, and I think that's fascinating as well, because there was a lot of human creativity involved in that. But you know, when DALL-E came out and Stable Diffusion came out, people immediately just started saying, "Oh, we can do movies with this. You just have to generate a sequence of images." So with DALL-E, it's kind of hard because you cannot reference a previous image. But with Stable Diffusion, it's way easier. So just last week, I saw like 3 different like first films generated by an AI, and they were actually. Yeah, which was pretty cool, and it was, you know, a display of human creativity.
Super cool.
Yeah, kind of like using the tool in a way that it was not intended for, kind of hacking it.
I mean, Vortex has been doing that since 2016.
True.
You know, OG. I remember when that came up on HN, and like everyone was like, "Wow, this is super." Oh, yeah, weird moment. Sorry, Rodolfo. Go on.
No, but and obviously the films were kind of like very low quality, and you know, it was just images stick together, but. And in a year's time, there's gonna be, you know, DALL-E 3 generate your own little like 30-second video, and then plug it with some music thing, and then
Yeah. So one of the things that like I like thinking about systems and, you know, what impact these components will have on the bigger flows of people, technology, money, etc. It does strike me that the rapid progress in the text to image stuff suggests that there's going to be no one company which like makes their billions. Like there'll be a lot of people that make plenty of money out of this stuff, but it doesn't look like it's going to be monopolized because, you know, when DALL-E 2 was released, even in the private beta and the things that were coming out on the socials, people were like, wow. But then, yeah, Midjourney was pretty cool too. You know, Stable Diffusion is amazing. It certainly seems like the people who invested in those companies aren't going to get their 100x ROI. It doesn't seem. I mean, look, I'm not a venture capitalist, so I don't. Like maybe they will, but it certainly doesn't seem like it's going to be winner takes all. I guess that's what I would say. But well, because yeah, I mean, there's a lot of it's a Cambrian explosion at the moment.
There is, but the models are so. I'd make the argument that yes, right now. But as the models get larger and larger, it's only going to be...
A few people have the resources to play.
That's it. I mean, like, you know, only a few companies will have access to both the storage and the compute to be able to generate models that are large enough for that.
Yeah, but that is certainly true. And I mean, one other thing, going back to your point, Stephen, like all of us, I mean, we are all addicted to our phones. I can no longer stand my own company for 60 seconds without reaching for my pocket and doing these ones. It's terrifying, but it's like that. I'm working through that anyway. But
We can help.
But so often the stuff isn't actually that compelling. You know, I'm not worried about the ceiling of the AI generated stuff. In some sense, once it passes the floor of what I will waste time on, which empirically is not that impressive. Like, content doesn't have to be that good for me to mindlessly scroll. Once we hit that point, which arguably we're already there, that's when shit gets real. Well, I mean, let's go to Stephen first, and then we'll. This.
I mean, I feel like you're just going off. I was just going to talk about it's what you said with optimizing. We can look at it from like an economic metaphor, where if we let the market optimize on its own, that doesn't mean that whatever's happening in the market is socially optimal. And so we make regulations and rules to stop companies from polluting our waters just because that's what saves them money. And what's happening now is we're moving into what optimizes. I mean, in the Symposium, hearing some of the industry talks was great, but also it felt like it really felt commercial. It's like, well, what's going to maximize some profits, which makes sense, right? And it's like the ideas are great and they're really interesting, but it's also worth sort of taking a step back and thinking about, okay, but what if we are just generating so much content and we are making so much profit? It's like, what's that social effect?
Well, I mean, there's a related thing, right, where a great local example of this that happened a long time ago. So there's this company based in Sydney called Aristocrat Gaming. And when I was at uni a very long time ago, we did like a course called it was the software engineering course, right? And so it's software quality, sorry. And we went on a site visit to Aristocrat, and it was startling, right? So this was early 2000s, and they'd employed a mathematician there. Yeah, pokie machines. I mean, this is it. You know, they're the biggest manufacturer of pokie machines in the world. And they had a statistician working with someone who was like, did really basic design. And they basically figured out the minimum user interface they'd need, like literally the minimum number of flashing lights, one of the most basic sounds they could do to monopolize people's attention and generate addiction. It was horrifying how simple it was. And the guy was explaining it was completely dead inside. It was quite scary. But, you know, but thing is, yeah, and you're talking about the flaw, right? So you got this algorithmically generated content. What is going to be, the real danger is going to be not perhaps in its sophistication, but more in how it's deployed and how it's deployed at scale. And like, this has already happened with Facebook. I mean, Facebook is like a giant pokey machine, right? It's just one dopamine hit after another, and it was tested at scale on a bunch of people, basically on all of us, right? And they've figured out what's needed to drive our attention, and how does it need to be simplified to drive that?
And I think also going back to the point of, is there going to be a winner take all? I think one thing that I'm very hopeful of is this open source movement, kind of like reclaiming these models. I mean, like DALL-E 2, yeah, we can replicate that. And I used to believe also that, you know, there's no one who can compete with OpenAI, with Microsoft, but we've seen that just a decentralized group of weirdos on the internet
Catherine
can
Krausen.
figure it out, you know, and it's pretty close. Like Stable Diffusion is open source and is, if not better, if not as good, probably, if not better, probably as good as DALL-E 2. And also, like, in terms of the economic incentives, I think that's a much better model as well, because, you know, if we had an open source Facebook that was not maximizing towards profit, but was maximized towards whatever the open source crowd wants, which probably, I mean, could get scary as well, but probably would be more socially aligned than just, you know, Zuckerberg's and the shareholders' intentions. So I think the open source movement, I think, is really interesting, and yeah, I think I call for all of the creative technologies to size the means of automation.
Of the means of production.
Yeah.
Yep.
You can tell that we're in machine learning because we're just constantly talking about optimization. Just like, how do we, what fitness function can we do to optimize the world?
I'd love to.
Chloe, what do you reckon?
I think, you know, something that has been coming up throughout the whole event is kind of then why are we doing this if we're kind of aware of all of these real, it's kind of like it's bound to happen. But kind of, yeah, as Rodolfo was saying, like, I do think we have the opportunity to, like come together, but also like, I think it is important to have at least hope that, action, if we're moving along one path, that there are actions which can, deviate our path and make, real change. So that is.
Chloe, would you, just to contextualize the areas that people are working, would you talk briefly about your honours work?
Yeah, sure. So my honours work, I was looking, kind of similar to what I was just saying, but basically about almost the effect of coming into contact with AI-generated images. Because, in sort of talking about like, AI filters on TikTok, almost like the more I see AI generated images, the more fleeting the experience is. Like I remember the first time I saw something, I was like, wow, this is so cool. Like I want to learn more. And it kind of over time, you're like, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that's also cool. But yeah, I was sort of interested in whether we could have experiences while working with AI or viewing AI art that, gets us to think about the world and think about, how we perform and what we do. I mean, even listening to Jay talk earlier was really interesting, kind of looking at that idea if we're, on one path, looking at gender in how we, do data sets and do machine learning. How can we, retrain and relearn? So yeah, I basically generated using images taken from the Bunnings warehouse website, downloaded a lot of hand tools and would generate images of tools, which I would then 3D model, 3D print. I'd make little kind of, what are they called, product catalogs out of the images, basically playing with how can we almost play with these outcomes to extend the interaction, to kind of make people look at AI generated things for a little bit longer. And whether that could actually lead to kind of like almost like lots of people call it like a defamiliarization experience, where what was known or seemingly taken for granted or assumption, it kind of just opens up that space to be like, okay, so what are tools? And you know, thinking about tools is extremely relevant when we're talking about AI, for example. So tools have kind of, you know, a performance, an affordance, something that you do with them. So if we're using AI to kind of explore the role of tools, open up that assumption, like let's also kind of reflect on the assumptions we're making about AI as a tool. What are we doing with it? Yeah, so that's kind of a little overview of my work.
Yeah.
What do you think is the difference between a tool and a collaborator or a colleague?
Yeah, yeah. That's
in
really.
the Bunnings catalogue.
Yeah. Basically, I have a lot of kind of competing thoughts about that at the moment because, and obviously having lots of conversations with Ollie, I think there's kind of lots of different ways you can look at it because I don't think you can say that like AI is an extension of your hand, for example, as we often talk about tools, that it's just an extension of your hand and you look at it and you know exactly what it's going to do. Something with AI, you can have an idea in your head and then when you actually go, it surprises you, which I think is actually, you know, something that I find interesting to engage with. So can you really say like, you know, that's a tool? If I like picked up a spoon and then like, I don't know, it was actually performing the action of a fork, I would be like, what the, this is, you know, is that still a tool then? If it's kind of going against, you know, the performance we associate with it or the action we associate with it. And for me, that's when it kind of goes into more of like a collaboration or a conversation where it's your ideas going into it. And that's not necessarily the outcome. It's, you know, not an extension of your hand. It's not like one complete action. It's kind of this back and forth, which I think, you know, you can kind of maybe say, well, that could just be like an advanced tool. But I kind of think that that moves into that space of collaboration.
Or an extension of our collective mind.
Yeah.
And just for a bit more contextualization, I'd love to just ask Stephen about his lab, Sensi Lab, because I think it is one of the very interesting places in Australia, and I think we need to nurture connections between academic institutes and industry. And I have a connection to Sensi Lab. My first job in Australia was with John McCormack at what was then called the Centre for Electronic Media Art. And I think John's always been a very interesting character because he's always been an artist sitting in an engineering department. And we have a few of those in Australia, but not as many as in other parts of the world. So it's a unique opportunity, I think. Do you want to update us on what's going on there?
Yeah, I could talk a bit about Sensi Lab. I joined Sensi Lab 3 months ago, and when I started at uni, actually, I didn't know Sensi Lab existed until I met my supervisor, Teresa. And first thing that comes to mind is it's just a perfect incubator for creative ideas and technology. It's a place where people are encouraged to make things, to build things. Everyone's got like very different backgrounds. Camilla, who sits across from me, comes from an architecture background. Myself coming from a more mathematical, deep learning background, but then right next to me is another PhD student who comes from, well, she did law as her master's, but she's working in more art. And I think having so many people from different backgrounds in this one space just sort of really helps with coming up with unique and different ideas. So Sensi Lab's a great place to think creatively, to innovate. It's a place where people encourage you to just build what you're thinking.
And does that sort of partially address what Emma Jane was talking about earlier, about having values right there from the outset that maybe wouldn't be there if you were in pure engineering society?
Yeah, I think so. It's something, again, coming from my background and where I used to work, which was very just heavily just engineering, you think in a very particular way. Engineers have a particular way of thinking, and that's why they're so good at what they do. Coming into a space where creative thinking, artistic thinking, which also brings in a lot of, just questioning each other. Something that I was used to being questioned, but it wasn't until I was in Sensi Lab that everything I said was questioned. I'd say something and they'd be like, well, why? And then I'd realize, actually, I don't know why. I just said that because something intuitively I thought it was right. So it was bringing out the creative inside of me as well. I never felt comfortable really talking about me as a musician and me as a creative until I was in a space where that was encouraged. And then thinking as a musician has really helped me in the work that I'm doing now, and it really helps with creative AI. Yeah, just different ways of thinking help you solve problems in different ways.
I don't even think I think that's a helpful perspective. And I don't even think it's that, like, engineers are like this and creatives are like this and we go to beat poetry events and, wear berets and stuff. People are beautiful and complex and messy, and each of us, inside of us, there are all two wolves, etc. So it's more about the culture of the place, where in some places there is limited ability to question, or even just, it's not even that you suppress, it's not even that you kind of have questions but you feel like you can't ask them, it's just that there is a way we do things and that's the way we do things. And in other places you have different people and a culture where you ask those questions constantly. And I mean, I'll be honest, so I spent 10 years as a faculty member in the computer science school, and then a year ago I moved to the School of Cybernetics. And in some ways it's been hard because I'm used to sitting in a room of computer scientists where somebody says something that a computer scientist would say, and all of the other computer scientists kind of nod, and then we move on and it's easy. And that's been less so in the School of Cybernetics, and that's been awesome overall, but I'd be lying if there weren't times where I was kind of frustrated because I felt like I just know what I think needs to be done and I just want to do it. And all of these people are constantly asking me to justify things. And finding the right balance between those two things is a beautiful dance that I'm still learning to get the hang of, but I do think it's an important thing. And I think the one thing to riff on what you were saying, Stephen, is in some ways it's a note of optimism for engineering organizations where you don't have to fire all your people and bring in these magical unicorn creative types. You just need to foster a culture where you ask why, and where you have, maybe sometimes it's about bringing in some different people so that not everybody has come from the same place and lived the same story, but you don't have to, again, get rid of everyone. You just have to make it possible for people to say, yeah, like, why is that? Or, how about we do it this way? And changing culture is hard. It's not easy, but it's perhaps easier than getting rid of it. Like, you don't have to scorch earth your team. Yeah,
and I guess I just want to reiterate something. Maybe I didn't phrase it properly, but it's not attacking the way an engineer thinks. It's right. It's the culture and the way it's done at Sensi Lab. But having people from different backgrounds as well has really helped build that culture. And, I didn't know the lab existed. I'm so fortunate that I ended up there, that I met Teresa, because I couldn't see myself working in a different space after working at Sensi Lab. So.
Got a question from Pierre.
Yes, thank you very much, panelists. It's really great to see your energy and your youth in this discussion. Sorry for my accent, I can't pronounce certain words. On the slides behind you, you have big risks and big threats. And I'm going to mention a new one, I hope from the scope of the discussion. TikTok, they just made a huge purchase of a chain of private hospital or something like that in China. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's, to me, it's mind-blowing in this list of threat and risk, this type of entrepreneurship, type of business going into healthcare. Healthcare is also big opportunities. For instance, something happened recently, a company born in Australia, now halfway in New York, Australia, called Synchron, BCI, brain-computer interface. They're doing better, faster than Elon Musk Neuralink through non-invasive surgery or minimally invasive surgery. They can put a chip up your brain through the veins. And someone with ALS, I believe it was, I'm not sure, but I think it was ALS. This patient was able to tweet with the founder of the company.
Wow.
without hands, without anything down the neck, through this type of technology. Mental health,
Imagine being given the opportunity to communicate for the first time and wanting to tweet.
yes. It goes also, creativity is therapeutic. Every artist knows it, right? They're doing that for their own mental health. There may be a responsibility now that maybe this door is open, thanks to technology, for creative to step into healthcare. But it's a tough world. You need to be ready to get under the magnification glass of the regulators, of the clinicians, of the scientists, metrics, numbers, things that you're not supposed to work this way as an artist, but this difficulty, could you turn it into an opportunity for the future generation of creative people and to be volunteer into that? And again, it will be tough because it's a world that has a lot of inertia, momentum. Traditionally, medical studies, for instance, are not for creative people, generally. So that's a question for you. Are you ready to try this fight and come my way? I'd like to see more young creative who have studied humanities, who are artists, and who are proud to be artists on their resume. So I'm not only a computer scientist, but I'm also an artist, I'm a creative, and I want that for the healthcare technology world.
I think, yeah, that touches on what we were discussing earlier about what is creativity, really, and that's a kind of worms that I don't know if we want to open, but definitely there's creativity in medicine, and there's creativity in all kinds of industries. And I think a really interesting perspective is not thinking about creative people, but creative cultures and creative contexts and creative ecologies of situated agents that are interacting in an environment. And that environment is the one that breeds creativity, and those interactions rather than individuals. So you can have a creative environment in healthcare, and you can have a creative environment in a university lab, or a non-creative environment. And it's not really about the individual agents, but how the agents are interacting with each other. So I think taking that perspective, you can really analyze any industry and find ways in which even AI can aid in that creativity as well. I think, that touches on a paper actually that Ollie and I and some colleagues from the School of Cybernetics are working on, which is kind of understanding the role that AI can have in a creative ecology, and really understanding not AI in isolation and being what is DALL-E creative, or is GPT-3 creative, but what is the role of DALL-E in a network of people trying to create something? How do they play within that role? And then I think that question is much more interesting because it's situated, and it's very different if you ask a question in a capitalist system trying to maximize profit versus in an open source system of people creating together, or in a hospital system, and that changes what the model is doing. So it's different if you're putting it in the context of the metaverse, automated content, attention extraction, or in the context of healthcare. It's very different answers to the question of creativity, or it almost becomes irrelevant if it's creative or not.
Yeah, I hope this is kind of in line of your question, but I kind of think that in some ways, as AI increasingly so affects all industries, it also kind of forces some level of collaboration, which I think is, kind of in line with what you're saying in artists kind of joining in on the healthcare discussion and contributing. I think especially when we think about something like, sorry, I'm just gonna, you think about something like misinformation and AI, which is obviously, a hot topic, and extremely relevant to something like healthcare. I do think there's lots of potential for not necessarily artists, but just, I guess we were just talking about the Sensi Lab, but people coming from many different backgrounds coming together to kind of think about how these issues could be addressed within, something like misinformation kind of hurting people's relationship with healthcare. So I guess it's, I think encouraging to think that potentially there could be more kind of fluid ideas of what industry you're in, but more so people with many different backgrounds collaborating on a universal issue.
I think just to add a different perspective on your question, it touches in a really interesting way on something that I'm very attentive to having taken on a bit more of a leadership role in research, which is the funding landscape and the role of the creative arts in universities and in how government funding funds creative arts in universities and outside of universities. And there has been a massive shift towards art having to justify itself not just for art's sake. And I'm very excited about the health applications. I mean, you know, it's sort of, as you say, it's an intuitive thing. We know about the social value of art. Sometimes we might frame that in a well-being context. Sometimes that language is very new to us and it's being sort of prized into it. Sometimes it's very relevant, particularly, say, in dementia care and in certain other areas. You know, we've got great evidence of the well-being effects of art and art therapy and music therapy.
Yeah.
But something else that happens is I do think we go too far, and we've been constantly required to externalize the value of the creative arts. And it's funny because we can do that via a social good argument, such as applying it in a healthcare context, but we can also just do it from a pure economic argument. Like, Australian government is perfectly happy to hear that we're going to make some technology that increases GDP, whatever that may mean. And it is just interesting to see how that goes compared to maybe a few decades ago, where I think you could make a much more coherent case just to talk about art for art's sake. And it's an interesting game that academics have to play. And then related to that, the startup world is sometimes incredibly different from public funded academia, but at other times the startup world is uncannily similar in sort of having to make these social value arguments, and also the way that the idea generation happens, which is something I think I'm increasingly attentive to, as we've really got this very mature and yet still pretty mystifying culture of startup activity that's sort of in its third or fourth generation or wherever it's at.
Would you rather stand in front of a panel of angel investors or the ARC?
Oh God. What about? I'll throw that one. I'll throw that one to the panel. What do you think, Ben?
Historically, I haven't had a heap of success with either, to be honest. But yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I want to know, are there any other questions? Like, we're 20 minutes from the end of this whole thing, which has been awesome. Are there any other questions from the crowd? Collective wisdom. Yeah, Ned. He's my PhD student.
I had a question related to the funding, actually, which was, and more just sort of like just a question for you all in terms of like what the future looks like for university funding, and what's your feelings about effectively what is patronage from big companies? How does that make you feel? Because it's not all straightforward, and it definitely comes with strings attached. So how does, as a generation of PhD students who are coming through the system now, what are your feelings about that, and what's your feelings about that? Because, there's obviously going to be a difference there.
So you mean industry investment and collaboration?
Effectively, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, even if it's sometimes it could be sort of like, arts grants for doing things or whatever, right? So how does that all feel? I'm like, I've seen it from the other side, but I don't, like from the industry side. And, it seems very altruistic, but what's it like on the other end, Does it feel weird? I don't know. I'm after like an honest perspective.
Well, do we want to start with the PhD eye view of that?
Yeah, you before we pollute the air with our jaded, cynical views,
Then we'll set you straight.
tell us what you think when...
Well, I haven't had personally funding from private companies, but what I will say is that, because when I used to work in the industry, one thing I disliked, and it might have just been my company, but I've heard similar stories, is there's a lot of meetings with a lot of buzzwords and a lot of salespeople trying to sell something based off a buzzword. So if my funding was anything like that, if it was like, well, we'll give you this money if you put this AI on the blockchain and then, like
something big data.
something big data and all that, which I don't think it is, but if it started moving into this like sales idea. One thing it really drew me to academia was that it really focused on like the concept, what I'm working on, right? And it's like I can sit there and I can justify why am I working on this? Why is it important? Outside of the fact that I need to sell it, right? Because maybe what I'm working on right now can't be sold until 10 years of work, right? But try tell that to my sales team, who's not going to wait 10 years for me to make a product, right? So if it's like that, I'm not super into it. But if it's more in like, we both had the same goal, right? We both want to achieve the same sort of concept. They're going to use it to eventually sell something, but I don't have to be a part of that sales process. It's like, this is my goal. This is what I want to achieve for the research purposes. They need it, then I'm kind of okay with that. And I think it's important that we do collaborate with industry. So,
And if I may jump on what you just said, the example of the brain-computer interface, it's more than 10 years in the making. And for more than 10 years, these teams have been constantly getting money from investors based on AI chip in the brain. But it was for real. And of course, you have one success story for one success story for 99 failures. But that's venture capitalism and entrepreneurship in advanced technology in medical can take 10, 15 years.
yeah, I mean, for sure. I think it's more, once it starts getting like unrealistic, not in terms of like the actual concept, but in terms of timelines. And it's like, well, that's when like the problems really start arising. If you're giving me all this like buzzwords and whatnot, and it's this hype, but you are willing to invest the time to actually create it, that's different. Because it's like, well, we actually want to do this. We don't want to just make money. We want to do this. But that's enough for me, I think.
Yeah, not a problem I'm currently facing. But yeah, I guess somewhat similarly, I think that there is research out there that requires, more funding.
We are going to line up a Bunnings collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm still waiting for that phone call.
Dabbling in the AI space, I think, recently.
Yeah, exactly. Any day now. But I think in a perfect world, that sort of research wouldn't have to rely on outside funding. It would, just be, we know that this will be good, so let's get it done. So yeah, I guess that's my basic standpoint on it. I think, it's great if, industry is interested. And I imagine for some people it really is coming from like genuine interest and genuine want for this thing to come to fruition. But I think, profit is always going to then kind of come into the research and put all of that kind of pressure on it. So yeah, I think it's a complicated field, right?
I think I almost came running away from industry into academia. I was working at one of these big tech companies doing, kind of advertising basically, or using these technologies for maximizing advertising return on investment. So I was like, man, I don't want to do that for the rest of my life. And it just felt like everything that you did had to have an impact on the bottom line. Yeah. And I kind of was looking for a place that you could do just things for their own sake, like, creative arts, and even technology can be for its own sake in some cases, and scientific research and fundamental research. And I think you do need these places where you're not looking at the bottom line all the time or the next quarterly report. You do need these places that have long time spans. There's this foundation called the Long Now, which they kind of like proposing this idea of having longer timelines, and then now it's way longer. So we do need these institutions that have longer nows and let you do things for their own sake. And I think, definitely you can have really productive collaboration between industry and academia and, kind of like bring in the best of both worlds. But I think it can go into that direction in which, well, so where's the impact on the bottom line, and we need to show results versus, I think there's a lot of creativity also in having a space in which you can just do things for their own sake. And a lot of the, if not most of the innovations that came out in the computer, the computer revolution and digital revolution were done at places within companies that just let people do their own thing. Bell Labs and all these companies, they would just, do your own thing, and you guys are crazy, you'll figure it out.
Xerox PARC.
Yeah, exactly. And then they took them and, but I think now we can be even way more creative in terms of how we design these institutions that have these longer nows and this, opportunity for people to just do stuff for their own sake.
Yeah.
So I'll confess I'm lucky in that the stuff that I build is software. So primarily, so I don't need millions of dollars, which you do if you're trying to build a particle accelerator. We need billions, trillions of dollars, or even medical device manufacturing. You need heaps more money because you've got to have clinical trials and all that stuff. So the money that I need to do the stuff that I do is comparatively small. But having said that, I have taken industry grants and will continue to do so. I mean, I guess, and again, maybe this is me being a sweet summer child, but I kind of take the money and then just make something cool, or at least that's what I hope to do, because often the grant agencies, they're not interested in micromanaging the small amounts of funding that are required for me to do my work. The last thing they want to do is like obsessively audit the stuff that I have done to check that it toes the party line or whatever. So, I sort of hope to continue to do it and just fly under the radar of any real scrutiny. And I guess that's not a situation that everybody's in. And Botika, it's a thought that certainly has crossed my mind, but, I think I'm pragmatic about if there's a vision for making cool stuff, and obviously if they ever get told, no, you can't do that because it's not in line with company values and stuff, then I probably wouldn't do that thing. I probably wouldn't work with that company again, for instance.
In practice, that's very rare because at least the jurisdictions I've been in, a lot of the time those grants, those fundings are really just tax breaks for the companies. And they basically get told and it's an incentive by the government. And then that relationship there is that if the company is thoughtful about it, that they'll offer resources to the university as well as the funding, because that's an opportunity to build relationships, right? But I was just more interested in it from an abstract point of view, right? Because the money is arguably tainted, right? So
yep.
How does that make you feel from a pure academic standpoint?
Yeah, so I think that's a question we face all the time, and the great thing I think is, I'm often worried that in academia I'm getting pushed in that direction, and there are certainly forces that are pushing you, like those industry-related grants that one of the ways that you can state the value of those is by commercial value or by the value to the partner.
As well as the shrinking of the pure discovery research grants too.
Actually, when you dig into it and when you speak to people at every level, there's quite a broad understanding. And I was in some training the other day, which was really interesting. It was negotiating with partnerships and with partners, industry partners, run by our knowledge exchange group. And this was kind of on the surface, it was about negotiating price, like financial stuff. But actually, the person running the workshop really drove home the fact that as an academic, you're kind of dealing in a multidimensional value space. It's never just about price. And so this is the thing. I think if you're confident and if you push those relationships are never just about commercial value. There's still a dark side to that. It can be about greenwashing or some other washing of reputation. Big tech companies that do shiny things with artists are always at risk of doing that. But we have great potential to just come at that, making the case for that kind of value and setting up the conditions for those kind of collaborations properly. I don't think I've perfected that by any means, but I think that's what increasingly there's this threat, but there's this also this potential within academia to be emboldened to make sure that is done in the right way. So making stuff that's free. I'd really like to get back to making open source stuff. That's the kind of, when I was doing my PhD, that was sort of all that mattered. If you made some cool open source software and people used it, then you were doing a great job. And so the truth is that's still totally acceptable, because we have, in the broadest sense, the ARC, for example, cares about impact, and it also cares about all these metrics, citation counts and funding income and so on, but at the core of it, it cares about impact. So you've always got the potential to make that case for impact. The problem is that you just have to keep resisting all of these sort of implied pressures, or sometimes very real pressures. So I'm sort of really optimistic, optimistic and cynical at the same time. It's just a hard job to do that properly.
And I also, I mean, the boundaries are becoming more porous, and I'm seeing currently several colleagues bouncing backwards and forwards between academia and industry. Haven't closed the door on doing that myself at some stage. I think that, and I kind of look forward to that. It seems like it's just one small manifestation of this broader trend in our society where people don't stick at their jobs like they used to, and that's the thing that certainly the whole white collar, without invoking kind of class kind of stuff, but I think there is a class element to it. The knowledge, the chattering classes, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, the creative classes, there is this musical chairs kind of thing going on where more...
You'd have to argue that you have a certain kind of, just frankly, you need to be in a relatively privileged position if you're the kind of person who can bounce between
Totally, yeah.
And industrial work, right? So to a certain degree that predetermines the outputs of that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the usual, those who have all of the privilege and opportunities, they unsurprisingly can make the most of those opportunities, whereas others just don't have them. The systems are not fair.
Can I pose a question to finish maybe on a more hopeful note?
Yeah, do it. That'd be cool.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I'm really fascinated about is this idea that tools create new art forms, or people create new art forms with the new tools that come around. With the paintbrush, the camera, the synth, and all of that. So that's an interesting perspective that I like to take to look at AI and just see how people are using it in weird ways and coming up with new art forms like promptology.
Yeah,
because you see it, emerging as a new art form. So, what sort of emerging art forms do you see coming up, or are you excited about from the areas that you're working in?
I guess I'll focus on music maybe. One area that I don't know if it's a new art form, but I think it's really cool is human AI improvisation. Right, and particularly because AIs can play, or not AI, just computers, machines can play an instrument or notes in a way that a human physically cannot. Right, like our hands are only so big, we can only play so many notes at one time. So improvising with some system that can play notes in ways that humans could never play could maybe create, who knows, a new genre. That'd be pretty exciting.
Nankara was doing that with the player piano like 100 years ago. So yeah, but the machine can
But to
play.
see from an improvising perspective as well, imagine improvising. There already is this technology out there, but just more sophisticated, something that's more enjoyable to listen to, and
I've sort of kind of just done a mental run through. A lot of it, I feel like it's very hard to just disconnect and be like, I know this is new. Everything's coming from, kind of building off, which is something that's, kind of cool. But something I'm kind of becoming increasingly interested in a part of, working with AI and making art is kind of not like data set photography, but just being aware that how we photograph things informs how things are generated. And then, I don't know, for me, that just really kind of transformed the way I think about putting together data sets and kind of, I'm not a photographer, but kind of interesting that photography as a skill or an art form kind of is making its way into image-based AI. Not really a new art form, but yeah.
What do you reckon, Rodo? Well, so I think, it's kind of been floating around the edges of a lot of the stuff we've done over the last couple of days. The real innovation, or I won't use that word, but one of the real changes since perhaps GPT-3 or that sort of time is just we've just gone from structured to unstructured inputs in the way that we interact with these systems. Natural language, images, but with no real. You don't have to label things explicitly anymore. You just use these big common crawl things. And that certainly has opened up the possibility, as an interaction modality, it's opened it up for so many people. Like even using AI stuff, 5-10 years ago, the code was all there, and you could buy a gaming rig with a couple of GPUs and train stuff, but just the data wrangling that you needed to do to make it work, you still needed to be literate in the world of computing and setting up a Python environment and that processing a CSV file or scripting a batch kind of script over a file full of folders or something like that. But now that these inputs are just pretty unstructured, text, audio, image, I think that both connecting them into one another is easier, but also just it's more accessible for people to play around with. And so I am really interested to see, I think it's this interface modality from relatively structured to comparatively unstructured. That is what I would like to see. How does that make the instrument different to play?
I was actually just gonna say that kind of.
Sorry to steal your.
No. The kind of stuff that you're doing with the tool that you demoed yesterday, kind of, I see that as a new art form and plugging together models, pipelining them together in weird ways. I think there's gonna be a lot of artists just their whole work just gonna be pipelining models in weird ways. And
Yep.
Yeah. That's really nice.
I'll give you a beta access.
It's kind of reminiscent though of like the analog video processing that happened in sort of like the late 80s, early 90s, where people would have these, literal pieces of hardware that would glitch video, that would, they'd run it through their, the folks would use Amigas and stuff and Genlock cards or whatever to sort of take that data through. And it just feels like a resurgence of that time, just with more sophisticated tools. And it's cool. It's cool.
Yeah.
What do you reckon, Ollie?
Well, my answer to that is going to be things like Boomi. I don't know if people know Boomi. It's one of the many AI music startups that doesn't necessarily use tons of AI, as we've been discussing. It's a lot about templated systems for someone without musical experience to throw together a musical track. But I'm just, and I don't want to claim I'm going to be excited by the music that I hear from it, because so far I'm not. But I'm very excited just by the cultural transition and that sort of unfolding of, various people like Brian Eno's sort of vision of the world of listening to static recorded music being replaced by a world of dynamic music.
Yeah.
Will we finally get music for airports properly?
I think we will, and I mean, this is now what I've been really turning my attention to, and I think there's, I mean, in terms of the threats here, there's some potentially serious problems, but from with any of those platforms taking off. But Boomi's amazing. I mean, you can go onto Boomi and within a minute you compose a piece of music and it's on Spotify or something like that, and the promise is that you might start making revenue, and who knows, maybe you make a hit and you've got no idea what you're doing. And it's just this incredibly interesting transformation of the social and cultural relations in music making. It could be awful, it could be really, really interesting and open up avenues. I'm remaining open.
Yeah, we're still waiting for the AI Sex Pistols, because being able to play your instrument has never been absolutely necessary with conventional instrumentation either, if you got the rest of the package right.
Well, like Simon was saying yesterday, that and that was a very sad thing to hear, that there's a trend away from guitar bands because guitar bands just don't do well statistically on platforms. Like, really?
I was very sad at that.
Yeah, but I don't have a guitar band, so yeah, I think we just have to live with that kind of change, but keep scrutinizing it and seeing the underlying factors. And we have hit way past the hour, and it's nice and warm in this room, so let's go get a cooling drink, those of us who are here in real life, and continue the conversation without a live stream on us.
Thanks, Ollie, for organising this thing, and Pierre and Chloe, were you part of the There was lots of organisers. It was great.
Here they
Thank
are
you.
again. Let's just
Rodo as well.
thanks to all of those people, and we hope we'll do this again, but we're not sure when. And we would love to keep the conversation going about what types of groupings and arrangements and conversations carry on So thank you very much for attending.